Well, we've been working our way through this whole question, how do we get food? We've gone through basic agricultural practices. We've gone through herding, pastoralism, nomadism. We are now working on advanced agricultural techniques. We've gone all the way up now from intensive farming, which was made possible through the invention of the plow. We're now up to mechanized agriculture. Now, mechanized agriculture is just another variation of intensive agriculture. And, but it gets its own category because it is very unique. While much of Southeast Asia, much agricultural development in the developing world continues to be intensive agriculture, nevertheless, in the world that we know in the West, it has moved into a high fever pitch that we call mechanized agriculture. And there are certain characteristics to this. The first one is that it is now agribusiness. Farming is a business. Intensive farming was developed by family farmers. A man owning a piece of property, farming it, selling it to the local wholesaler, and on it went. Agribusiness, businessmen are investing hundreds of thousands of dollars to bring together large tracts of land to establish a profitable income, and they will grow. They will hire, let's start with this, they'll hire people to run their agricultural businesses. You go up into the San Joaquin Valley and you're driving up there along Highway 5, and you will see acres upon acres of grapes. Who runs those grape vineyards? Well, probably some kind of an overseer who is paid to live on the property. He is not the owner of that property. He's simply the overseer. His boss, the owner of the vineyard, lives down here in Southern California. He lives down right on the beach. He's got a boat. As a matter of fact, the vast majority of the money that's being paid by the government to subsidize farmers are mailed to business addresses in Southern California. They're the ones that are running the businesses. They're making them financially profitable. I'm not going to say this is the end of the age of the family farm, but the family farm has been under intense pressure for the last couple of decades as agribusiness has begun to take over and run these farms, not as a family, but as an economic investment. They will rely very heavily upon hybrids and upon research. You will find the sons and daughters of these very successful large farming corporations or large ranches. You will find them going to college. They will go to an agricultural-based college, and they will be looking at new ways to breed or to genetically change fruits and vegetables and animals to make them far more productive. You will find them trying to grow or develop corn that is resistant to rust or disease, or that bugs don't like to eat. You will find them developing huger, bigger, fatter, redder tomatoes. Not only that, you will find them developing better ways to harvest their crops. They are trying to develop machines that have got little electronic fingers that will hang down from the arms of the tractor, and as they go over the tomato plants, the fingers will feel whether the tomato is ripe, and if it's ripe, cut it off. And if it's not ripe, skip over it, come back the next pass. As a matter of fact, they're doing everything they can to reduce what we call stoop labor. Now, have any of you ever tried to make a few extra bucks by picking strawberries? No one strawberry picker. I did it for 4 hours one week. And I said, that's enough of this. That hurts my whole back. I don't enjoy stoop labor. You're down there and you're bending over, and then you get down on your knees until your knees give up. Then you're crawling on your, after 4 hours, I finally walked in and said, I'm cashing in. I picked enough strawberries for the rest of my life. Now, I love strawberries, you understand, but I don't like stoop labor. As a matter of fact, most of us don't like stoop labor. That's why we farm it out to folk from south of the border who will come up here and work in the fields for us. Stoop labor is hard. Is there a better way to harvest these? Could we somehow or another grow strawberries that would pick themselves? You know what I mean? That's what they're trying to do in the universities. That's what all these Aggies are up to. They're looking for better ways. Get fatter chickens, plumper vegetables, happier cows. I don't know, but they're out to do it. Now, it is very technologically dependent. Because it's being developed in the laboratory, because it's dependent upon massive technology changes, the local farmer does not go down now and simply buy a tractor and get into business. They've got to have hundreds of thousands of dollars of equipment to run their farm. And when the tractor breaks down, it has to be repaired, and it has to bring in a mechanic. The summer I was working with my friend out in Arizona. A belt snapped on the harvester I was working on. Dang, we took a look at it. It's only the air conditioner. I can still sit in there and sweat and drink lots of water and listen to the stereo hi-fi in this harvester. It's a very uncomfortable, and he can run into town and get a new belt and come back out and put it back on, et cetera, et cetera. Now, this is interesting development because, of course, in Asia, your plow has very little chance of breaking down. There's not all that much to it. And you've got it being pulled by a bullock. And if your bullock gets sick, well, you kill it and you at least got some meat. But with technology coming into the field, as I go to Southeast Asia these days, I find farmers working in their rice fields, and they don't have water buffalo pulling their plows. You know what they've got? They got little electronic plows. You got those in Bali? No? Oh, come on. Everybody's got these little electronic plows, and they're going through the field, and running the engines. And so if that breaks down, they pull a couple bolts off and they run the motor into a small motor repair place, and the guy fixes it, brings it back, bolts it back down, back to working his field with one of these little portable plows. But it's become technology dependent. And one of the things that we did when we were living in a horticultural society was I managed to bring some watermelon seeds with me, a little packet of watermelon seeds. And we tried growing watermelon and discovered that we were at a cold enough altitude that watermelon did not do real well at our high mountain altitude. It just did not take. But we found that watermelon really grew abundantly down in the lowlands in the hot temperate climate. So we distributed our watermelon seeds down there, and every time I'd go down there, they would bring me a huge big watermelon to eat. Oh, I tell you what, nothing is more delicious than a nice big cold watermelon on a hot day. Love that. And there was another missionary that was there, and this missionary thought, oh, this is cool. I'm going to bring out some more watermelon. So she brought out some more watermelon seeds and gave them out to the people. And when I came down, she presented me with this big watermelon. She said, oh, you're going to really love this. These are from some seeds that I gave. And I said, oh, great, I'm glad to see it. She said, but this is really good watermelon. It's seedless. Seedless? That's technology. I mean, I love seedless watermelon, you know. It kind of ruins your seed spitting contest, but it's, you know, you don't have all those little black spots in your watermelon. But I said, oh, bummer. She said, why? I said, because the people can't replant this. You're going to have to continually bring in every season more seeds from overseas. It cannot be something that they will be able to capture the seeds themselves and replant them. She said, oh, I never thought about that. Well, that's because we are technology dependent and we forget the basic fundamentals of agricultural practices. It's also very energy demanding. Let's face it, in order to harvest crops today, you've got to have machinery, you've got to have tires on the machinery, you've got to have gasoline for the machinery, you've got to have energy for processing it, for transporting it. The energy levels of consumption rise very, very dramatically as we get into mechanized agriculture. We are one of the most energy demanding cultures in the world. Granted, we grow the most amount of food, but in order to grow that food, we have to produce more energy. In order to produce more energy, we have to use up currently more fossil fuels. We need to find a new way to have renewable sources of fuel so that we can continue to grow and produce food at the extent that we are producing food. And finally, it is market driven. You grow crops according to what the market will pay. So, soybeans. How many of you like to eat soybeans? Oh, a few of you. High proportion of you Asians, I notice, because of course soy is good stuff, you know. And there's a great restaurant right around the corner down there on Beach Boulevard, soy restaurant, and boy, that soy soup is politely, oh, it's delicious. When I get all done having soy soup, I like to go to McDonald's and have a real meal. You know what I mean? You know, something that used to bite back. But anyway, soy, there's a good product out there or a good market for soy. Everybody's learning to eat soy because it's healthy for you. It doesn't create heart attacks, et cetera, et cetera. So grow soybeans. But as they started to move more fields into growing soybeans, they stopped growing corn until we decided that we wanted to turn corn into a combustible fuel for automobiles. And then the corn market went back up. And now every year, ranchers have to decide, soybeans, corn, soybeans. And they will determine what they will do depending upon the market demand and its availability for producing an environment that allows for maximum profit. Well, this is a long way from folks sticking a stick in the ground, dropping a corn kernel in there with a dead fish or minnow, and planting corn to growing hundreds of acres of corn with combines and all the rest. But there's an interesting question that arises in all of this. How do we go about getting our food? I want to ask you 3 questions about food production. And it may seem silly to you, but this has been a point of major conflict over the years. Which form of food production is the most compatible with being a Christian? Let me ask you the second question as well. Is one of these forms, that is foraging, horticulture, intensive, or mechanized, more Christian than another? And the third question, what constitutes an appropriate response to God's command to be fruitful and to multiply? Now you say, what are you getting at, Hayward? I'll tell you what I'm getting at. The forms of food production have been a source of tension between various cultures. The very first major conflict in the Bible is between Cain and Abel. A pastoralist versus a farmer. And there were the range wars all through the Midwest, all through the western states, between the sodbusters and the ranchers. There was a major conflict between early European settlers who came to the New World and who set about to cut down the forest and to create larger fields where they could grow crops. And they looked at the Native American foraging lifestyle as being inferior, uncivilized, and pagan. As a matter of fact, I have this lovely quote from a man who was a member of the Bureau of Indian Affairs back under the days before the United States became an independent country. It was still part of the colonies. He was attached to take care of the Indian Affairs, and he made a speech before the representatives who were gathered there, and he said, "It is our Christian duty to teach these uncivilized pagans how to farm, because farming is God's way of increasing the multiplicity and the fruitfulness of the earth." We have a God-given choice, a command to turn Native Americans into farmers. And if they resist our attempts to turn them into farmers, then the only option that we have available is to drive them out of these lands where we are farming and to force them to live up around the Great Plains or Great Lakes, where no husbandman, that was his term, where no husbandman would want to go. Now, where did he want to drive the Indians away to? Well, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Upper Michigan, all those places where they thought it was too cold to grow crops, and where the forests were so dense that it was almost impossible to do farming. I mean, my ancestors arrived in Canada back in the early 1800s, and the forests were so thick, the trees were so close together that they made a road from Quebec into Ontario. And travelers on that road would talk about, even in the height of the noonday sun, the growth of trees was so heavy and hung so close over the road that it continued to be dark even on a bright day. that was how it was up there. It would take enormous effort to turn the northern provinces, the northern states, into agriculturally productive land. And these early colonialists believed that it was their God-given duty to make Native Americans farmers. Learn to farm or take your primitive way of living off into the areas that we don't want. I'm afraid this characterized the whole process of early Native American colonial conflicts. So, does God intend for us to be farmers? And if so, what kind of farmers? Is it enough just to be horticulturalists? Or must we become the kind of farmers who will maximize food production? Well, there may be different answers to all of these, depending upon their implications. Intensive agriculture can be done in a manner that is healthy for the soil, that is balanced in the ecology, and I think we would want to move in that direction. We do not want to destroy the productivity of the world as we know it. We want to enhance it. If we're going to fulfill God's command, we have to make the earth more fruitful, not less. What the early Native Americans did, what the early agriculturalists did, was begin to produce greater quantities of food to meet their population demands. We're having to do the same thing today. So the final answer, it seems to me, and there's only one, the Bible does not require any one form over another. None is more or less Christian than another. We see, except for the mechanized, because they still didn't have internal combustion engines in the Bible, we see virtually every one of these forms of agriculture or husbandry or horticulture or even hunting and gathering in the Bible with absolutely no judgment rendered at them. What God commands us to do is to be responsible stewards of the resources that God has given to us. And this is where I believe we have a starting point for a Christian approach to ecology and earth care. Of course, that's another whole set of questions. Well, we've brought ourselves up to this present era, but there is one more question we have to ask. Why did people in early cultures choose to build and live in cities? To tell you the truth, I do not enjoy living in the city. You will not find me wearing a t-shirt that says, "I heart New York." Sorry about that if you're from New York, But, I grew up in the inner city of Toronto back before you folk were even a bright light in your parents' eye. I grew up in the city. I knew what it was like. I moved to LA, grew up in Los Angeles. I know about the city. It is not my first choice. I have lived in a variety of environments. I lived for a while right on the boardwalk in Hermosa Beach. Step out the front door, lapping of the ocean, lovely white sand. Oh, great place to live. Not. Summertime, it's covered with all these sweaty bodies and cars parked every which way. You had to park 6 blocks away to try to come home after church on Sunday. The crowds that were there. I don't like crowds. Present crowd accepted, of course, you understand. I kind of see myself as a mountain man, you know what I mean? Loner up there, just me and the eagles and the bears and snakes. Well, maybe I'm not a mountain man. Matter of fact, let's take that all back. Well, I don't know what I am. But you know what? City is not my first choice. a lot of problems in the cities. So why would anyone want to move from the country to the city? Why did I come to the great Los Angeles basin? Well, two reasons. First of all, this is where the jobs are. And secondly, it's because God kind of twisted my arm. You know, I'm up there in Santa Barbara walking around the beach saying, I don't want to go to LA, Lord, I don't want to go. And he says, you're not listening, you're telling. And ultimately he won, of course, and I'm here. And I love it here. But you know what? I live 3 blocks off the end of Disneyland. If there's anything I said I would never do, it would be to live near Disneyland. I mean, nuts enough to gag you. And then I'm living in a condominium, which I said I'd never do. You know, I always wanted a little piece of property around me to separate me from my neighbors. Now the only thing that separates me from my neighbors is a double wall with with the insulation in it. You know, he hammers on the wall and I hammer back. You know, why would anybody want to give up the freedom, the independence, the luxury, the joy of country living to living in the city? Well, for some reason or another, people did. Very early in the human experiment with societies. And we have to ask ourselves why. Now, there is no nice, easy answers. We do not have the answers written for us. The people who started moving into cities did not leave written records. So we have to make some guesses. And what I'm going to do here now for the rest of our time today is to look at this whole question of why might people have begun to build the first cities in order to move out of the diverse horticultural societies that had once pervaded. So, we're going to talk about the emergence of the first states. And we want to talk about the characteristics of a state. What do we talk about when we talk about a state? Well, a state consists of many communities that are functioning as an independent political unit. So it is a number of communities, not just a couple of families, but several different communities that are coming together now, and they're going to become a self-organizing, self-governing political unit. Secondly, as they come together in order to meet their shared needs, they're going to have to establish a centralized form of government. And with that centralized form of government, they're going to have to raise some money to pay for the things that they need to do. Once you get all these people living together, there are a couple of things you've got to address. One of the most important of these issues of what they have to address is, how do you get rid of garbage? And you say, what? Yes. We people get together and we got to get rid of fecal matter. We've got to get rid of rotting food. We've got to get rid of all of the stuff that is no longer of use to us, but that will build up dramatically. Let the city go on a garbage strike and you'll discover how important garbage disposal is to us. So they've got to have the power to impose taxes to pay for people to dispose of the garbage. We have to have the power to impose taxes, to raise protective forces like a police or some other form. We have to have people who will spend time taking care of our shared needs. So they will impose taxes. They will also draft men for work or for war. They will have to have a standing army or a police force. And they will have to make and enforce laws. Take a look at the transition between a loosely organized set of communities under the time or during the time of the prophet Samuel. And the people come to Samuel and they say, Samuel, we want a king just like all the other nations. And Samuel says, silly idea, you don't want a king. They say, yeah, we do. He says, no, you don't. Yeah, we do. And finally he says, look, if you get a king, you know what he's going to do? He's going to impose taxes on you. Oh, they said we love taxes. Well, that's because they weren't paying any, Nowadays, they'd be members of they wouldn't be members of the Tea Party. They'd be followers of, well, let's not get political. Anyway, we love taxes. And then he said, but he will then take your sons and your daughters, and he will bring them into service. He'll put them to work. He'll turn them into soldiers. You'll have to have a standing army. And they said, oh, we love the fact that our kids will have a future with civil service. I hadn't seen the evils of civil. Once again, I got to watch myself. I get into politics here. Then we're going to have to make and enforce lots of laws. You'll have laws all over the place. Oh, they said, that's exactly what we want. We want more order. So you remember, Samuel struggles with them. He says, no, don't do it. Finally, he goes before God, and what does God say?
They didn't reject you, they rejected me. They're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me.
They're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. They're unwilling to trust me. So God allowed them to go ahead and have a king. And Saul is brought in as the new king. And sure enough, imposing taxes, drafting men, making and enforcing laws, and all of the problems that come with having kings. Well, those are the conditions of statehood. But why? Why would people want this? What prompted mankind to give up a rural, independent, agricultural lifestyle for life in urban centers or under state control? This is the research question that we are proposing. Like a good proposal, we're going to start testing the data to see if our proposal can come up with some answers. If we look in the Bible, we will discover that Cain knew his wife and she gave birth to Enoch, and he built a city. That's like, second generation in the history of humanity. Well, I wish I knew whether this genealogy is actually, 100 years or 200 years, and whether you can build a city and what a city is here. I'm not going to try to analyze all of that. I don't have a real good answer to that. What was the first city like? I don't know, but I can begin to go back into history a little bit, since the Bible is blessedly vague about the emergence of cities or what they look like or why they were started. But we can go back to two possible reasons why people started to live in cities. The first one is to suggest that they did so voluntarily. We want to live in cities. Our second option, of course, is that we would say it would be they were forced into living in cities. What's it going to be? These are our two theoretical options, voluntarily or under compulsion. Well, let's try a couple of hypotheses here. If we look at possible options here, as more and more people got together, they needed more right to have organized labor. organized effort. We could establish an organized effort that would allow for greater control over resources, greater control over the land, greater control over the water, greater control even over labor. When you can have call a work party and be assured that everybody's going to show up for it and that they will work so many days per year or month or whatever, you can then begin to predict what kind of labor force you can come for controlling your resources. You can also call upon a workforce for waging war. Now, in waging war under less complex societies, you really can only draw upon volunteers. But under an organized state, you can now get a system of draft, if you would. You can begin to draft your citizens, and they will be compelled then to go to war in order to expand the strength and stability of the state. So, the organized effort, bringing greater control over resources. This would help you to build and manage irrigation systems. Remember, we saw the value of wet rice farming in Asia, where you could have thousands of people being fed on a square mile of paddy fields. Wonderful stuff. Who's going to build those fields? Who's going to build those rice paddies? Who's going to terrace all of that? We're going to have an ability to build and then to manage those irrigation systems. And if some guy in the middle of the paddy fields decides he's not going to take care of his field that year, that destroys everybody below him and their attempts to get water. You know what? He's out of here. Somebody else takes his place. How do you get him out of here? You have to have control over your labor force. It will also give you a greater opportunity to build structures. What are some of the structures that you're going to want to build? A wall. A wall that will allow you to get behind defensive barriers against your enemies. Now, my ancestors, way back, who knows when, were over there on the western side of England, and they were flat up against the Welsh, who were a warrior nation, and they were flat up against the Saxons on the other side. And so they were in a constant series of conflicts over people who wanted their land. So what did my people do? They built these huge walls, well, dikes, if you would, so that when the Welsh came attacking my people, they had to fight uphill. My folk had the advantage of being able to shoot downhill at them. It wasn't very sophisticated, but it was a defensive barrier to protect their land against people who wanted to take it. So they were building defensive barriers. They eventually learned to build defensive forts. You go up into Central Europe in the, well, even as late as the 800 AD. And you've got all of the folk up there, the Saxons, and every night they've got to go into a barricaded fortress to protect themselves against marauders at night. And those barricaded fortresses consisted of walls with poles that are sharpened sticking out of them, with guard posts. And once they got in for the night, they would close the gates and nobody else could get in the barricade there for the rest of the night. You had to spend the night outside of the fortress. And it's while they were in there that they would then have their evening meal and they would relax in sufficient safety behind their barricades. So they began to build structures. They also began to appoint certain people to occupation specializations. They turned some people into boat builders. They turned others into agriculturalists who would take care of raising animals, training them. They began to train horses to pull chariots or wagons, and so on and so forth. They started to get teachers, politicians, probably lawyers. But then again, not every society is perfect, is it? Well, allow occupational specialization. They could now begin to develop some of the things that will give them a chance to advance more rapidly. It also gave them an opportunity to be more effective in warfare. One of the things that we discovered was the cultures that grew in population the strongest, the most effectively, and who took over the most lands were the ones who could most effectively raise an army to defeat their enemies who opposed them. We'll talk about this as we talk about organizational leadership, but the ability to protect what you own and to suppress your enemy became one of the key factors in how a society was able to grow and increase in its effectiveness. Now, one would think at times that warfare would lead to the formation of a state. And indeed, it has been instrumental in forming states. People pulled alliances together. As they pulled their alliances together, as they built their armies, they were able to intimidate their neighbors and to insist on some kind of peace terms. But that is not a hypothesis that we can continue to support with any kind of evidence. It is well, there's actually a couple of hypotheses. What is the warfare hypothesis? Nations came together, or people came together, formed nations in order to protect their interest in war. There is also what we call the water principle. Oh, they all came together voluntarily to create agricultural groups for irrigation systems. And since irrigation systems require such a massive amount of work, they organize themselves, as you see in Asia, to be able to manage water. How do we determine which one of these hypotheses is going to work, or whether either one of them are good? Well, let's take a look at the location of the early states that started to emerge around the world. You have, first of all, early record of civilization in Egypt. All right? Secondly, we find the emergence of civilization early in the human record around Mesopotamia. Now, Egypt, what do you know about Egypt? What makes Egypt significant? Nile River. Okay? Mesopotamia. What makes Mesopotamia significant? Okay, in Mesopotamia, is it not the Euphrates River? Okay, so Indus Valley. Where is the Indus Valley? Oh boy, don't tell me you flunked that part of your high school courses. Indus Valley? Okay, let's give it a guess. Germany? No, okay. China? No. South Asia? Okay, South Asia. Okay, Indus Valley down there. It's the great watering center for India and Pakistan. Mexico. Mexico? Well, Mexico it was. Mexico is another major center where early civilizations emerge, and China. And the point of the matter is, it's not just China, period. It is China around the Yellow River. Do you realize that over 1/3 of all of the people of China live around its two major river systems? Another 1/3 live along the coast, and 1/3 populate all the rest of China. Rough figures. All right? So, if we were to look at this, well, let's do one more. Peru. Peru will be another area where we have major civilizations arise. Now, in case you're wondering, Mexico is going to be Aztec. Peru is going to be Inca. Okay, so we've got all these major civilizations emerging. Well, now we're tempted to look at some characteristics. Major rivers. Well, major rivers works for Egypt, Mesopotamia, Indus, and China, but it doesn't work for Mexico or Peru. So the major river hypothesis is out. But what other traits might be in common if we were to look at these 6 geographical regions? Well, all share the same ecological traits. Okay, now I'm using an ecological argument here, even though I do not like cultural materialism as an explanation for social behaviors. I believe it gives us some strong insights. This is one of them. They have the same ecological traits. You have rich agricultural potential bounded by marginal lands. Rich agricultural potential bounded by marginal lands. Let's look back at Egypt. Egypt, the only arable land, the land where they can grow food, is along the banks of the Nile River, or the floodplains where the Nile River floods out into surrounding territory. The rest is desert. You cannot grow anything in the deserts. It is all dependent upon that narrow strip of land along the Nile. Same thing in Mesopotamia. You look at Iran. All of the agricultural potential of the land is along the watered areas of its major river systems. The rest is cold, bleak, rough lands, mountainous lands, lands that are not fit for gardening. The Indus Valley, once again, you look at all of northern India there where the Indus Valley flows, and you find desert everywhere except right around the river. There is only so far that you can move away from the river before it becomes impossible to do any more agriculture. Look at China. You go away from the rivers in China and you run into mountainous lands, you run into the Gobi Desert. It's not a good place to be. There is a marvelous movie, if you don't mind listening to a Chinese movie, and Chinese movies are like so many Asian movies. If it ends with a sad story, if it leaves you crying, it's a great movie, So no happy endings in Chinese movies. But there's this marvelous movie called Shower. And the movie starts out with a Chinese girl way up in western China, up in the dry parts, and she's getting ready for her marriage ceremony. And she has to perform a ritual bath of purification before she can be joined to her husband. And so her parents have to fill the bathtub of water. And she's sitting in the bathtub of water and she's crying. She's crying her eyes out. And you think, hey, this is supposed to be the happiest day of your life. You're getting married, et cetera, et cetera. But she's in the bathtub knowing that in order to get enough water to fill the tub for her to have her ceremonial bath, her parents have had to exchange a bucket of oats for a bucket of water. And the bucket of oats is their supply of food for the winter. They're going to starve all winter long in order to give her the bath so that she can get married. Well, wow, all of a sudden the poignancy of water scarcity, et cetera, begins to hit you. And ultimately, the couple have children. They move to another part of China. And the father, who was the groom in the original scene, now owns a bathhouse, a Chinese bathhouse, and the whole story that revolves around life in the Chinese bathhouse. Great movie, obviously a sad ending that I won't tell you about, but break out of watching crazy American cinemas. I mean, how many times can Bruce Willis die hard? I mean, it's time to do something different. Anyway, China, huge sections of inhospitable land. Mexico, what do you have in Mexico? Mexico is an interesting situation because you have the Gulf of Mexico and the Pacific Ocean coming together, almost cutting North and South America in two. You have a very narrow stretch of land. You have a very mountainous stretch of land. And there's not a lot of places to grow food in Mexico. You have very limited expansion. But you get up into Mexico City itself, where the capital was. There is some very beautiful land for growing purposes. It is a delightful environment, but it's limited. Same thing in Peru. You go down to Peru. What do you find? You find the Pacific Ocean to the west, and you find the Andes to the right. Now you get above, depending upon the exact ecology of the region, you get above 10,000 feet, you're not growing an awful lot. Now they did discover some marvelous ways to grow food at high altitudes. They put in a lot of irrigation channels, and the irrigation channels caused a steady flow of water through the fields, and that water tended to keep the cold weather from coming down because the water would not chill as rapidly as the soil. And so they managed to maintain a certain kind of climate control within limitations for growing crops. Very, very ingenious how they grew potatoes at such high altitudes. But that's again, take that up in a biology or ecology class. In Peru, you've got these very limited lands. Can't go to the east because you've got mountains, can't go to the west because you've got the ocean, and then you've got all of this land down along the coastal plain. What do you discover? All of these rivers flowing down out of the mountain to the ocean create lush valleys all along the coast. Those lush valleys become ideal places for people to gather, to grow food, to build their homes, and to conduct the necessities of living together. But again, it's marginal land. In between these lush valleys are mountain peaks, mountain passes, or dry, inhospitable land. So we discover an ecological principle. See? Agricultural lands that are rich with potential but unable to grow and expand extensively. So, let's put together a hypothetical sequence of events. And it has to be hypothetical because we weren't there. We don't know. We're just trying to get our minds into their minds. Agricultural centers begin to emerge in each of these places. Folks start gardening, they start growing, they start planting garden plots, they start increasing the amount of food that they can produce. And as they are able to produce more food, population begins to grow. As you can feed more people, you can support more people. You can afford to have larger families. You are not going to have people scattering out of hunger, and you're not going to have people dying of starvation. There's just one problem. As you grow more food, as your population begins to grow, you have no place to move to. You move into the desert, not a happy solution. You move into the mountains, not a happy solution. There is no place for you to move to, no place for your people to expand to. So land becomes scarce. We start having conflict over the best garden lands. We find ourselves holding on more firmly to our land. We start having claims of land ownership. What began early in horticultural societies where the whole village owned a plot of land, all of a sudden now we're starting to go to individual families claiming land rights. So land rights issues are going to begin to emerge as a serious point of conflict. I have a right to this land. I have farmed it. My father farmed it. My grandfather farmed it. You can't have this. And if you have limited land resource, what happens when, well, let's take me as an example. I've got a plot of land. Let's say I've got 5 acres. Oh, I am doing really well with 5 acres. And I have 2 sons and a daughter. And my daughter married somebody else, so I don't have to worry about her. She's going to take over her husband's inheritance. I now have 2 sons, so I give my 5 acres, split it right down the middle. I give 2.5 acres to my son, and my other son gets 2.5 acres. Well, now they're going to have to hustle a little bit because what was a comfortable life for me on 5 acres is going to be much more demanding on 2.5 acres. But then they each have 2 kids. Now they got to divide it down to 1.25 acres. And you find out what happens. Eventually, there's not enough land to support them. They've got to get new lands. They've got to go somewhere else. They've got to increase their land holdings. So there's this constant conflict over land. So, according to our hypotheses, people are going to have to organize themselves to protect from predatory neighbors or legal wranglings over land. As they begin to organize, they appoint governors, they appoint police, they appoint military, they become more prone to set up protective devices to shield them from people who want to take their land and to address the internal conflicts within the culture. We're developing now a legal system, a police system, a military system, and a political system. So, can we test our hypotheses? Is this one any better for our thinking than anything else? Well, let's look at settlements in the Amazon region. The Amazon is a huge river, one of the largest rivers in the world. If our water hypotheses held up, that civilizations would grow up along major rivers, we ought to have a major civilization emerging in the Amazon basin. Does it happen? No. We do not have a major civilization arising and being sustained for any length of time in the Amazon. Well, what about North America? You've got the Mississippi River, huge river. We ought to have a major civilization emerging along the banks of the Mississippi River. We do have some Native American villages that do begin to expand. They quickly break up and fall apart. They were unable to sustain that kind of lifestyle, a civilization or a nation state type of society. Same thing for Central Africa. You have the Congo River. You have other major rivers. You do not have major civilizations growing up around a major river. Why? What is it about the Amazon, North America, and Central Africa? Here's the one thing that we discover as we look at all three of those. In the Amazon, when a village starts to grow large, and you start to get 50, 100, 150 people, conflicts emerge. The way to resolve conflicts is to become more organized socially, legally, militarily. But the other option is to just simply say, hey, you want to know something? I don't like you people. You are hard to get along with. You are being unreasonable. We are getting out of here. And so half of the village will up and move. And they'll move further upriver. See, the Amazon's a big place. There's lots of water. There's lots of potential places for growing food. They would move away. And so you get people in the Amazon, instead of organizing and intensifying, of breaking up, separating, moving further and further into the jungle. If there was an opportunity to move away from trouble, they chose it. Same thing in North America. You had such a wide valley. You had the whole Mississippi Valley, the Ohio River. Oh, I'm not even going to name all of the rivers that flow into the Mississippi. Lush lands. When you got into too much trouble with your neighbors, you simply packed up and moved on to another lush area. Same thing in Central Africa. You get diversification. The tribes keep separating out and breaking and moving further and further. As long as they could move away from trouble, people did it. They only organized when there was no place to go to. Well, are there any exceptions to our hypotheses? Because if we can find exceptions, this will either help prove the hypotheses or they will tear it apart. Well, let's take a look. You do have the emergence of some areas with resource concentration that are a slight exemption to our rule. For instance, up there in Washington, maybe a little bit down into Oregon, and then up into British Columbia, you have a very large population of people. And they never formed a civilization. Now, if time had gone on, they might have. But in point of fact, in the Northwest, they had so much resource to pull upon: salmon, wild food. There was such an abundance that they had not reached, as far as we could tell, a saturation point where food became a scarcity. So if you have a rich concentration of resources, there is no competition, there is no need to have to move away or to defend your land. You can continue to live in a non-unified social system. There is another possible exception here, And this is what we call socially circumscribed. All right? Circumscribed means to draw a boundary around something, okay? So to be socially circumscribed is to have a situation where it is possible to move, but in order to move, it's going to be very difficult for you. In order to move, for instance, the folk down in the Grand Valley of the Balim, where I was doing my missionary work, the folk in the Grand Valley of the Balim, a lot of their people bled off into the Western Highlands, where I was. When we had social problems in the Western Highlands and villagers couldn't get along, people would up and move. And there was all this virgin jungle the next valley over. So they would move over to the next valley and start a new garden on the far mountainsides. They kept moving away. They kept moving further west. But the folk who lived back there in the Grand Valley, when they started running into social problems, where did they have to move to? They couldn't just move to the next valley, because the next valley was where the Western Donny lived, the ones who had already fled from the Central Valley. They had to move west and then west still further. It became far too difficult. They had to move weeks of travel away. They would be separated from family support, from their old social systems, and they would have to start a life anew in a fresh jungle region against other peoples. It was just simply too hard to move. And so they would not move away, even though it might be possible, because they would have to jump over neighboring tribes that made it difficult. So what do we conclude? Well, we cannot know for sure if our answer is correct. We really don't know why people started new civilizations or why they started moving into more intense living strategies. But our ecological hypothesis seems best for us. It seems to offer a logical answer, at least for the time being. Perhaps in your generation, one of you will be a brilliant social scholar or ecological scholar, and you'll come up with a better thesis. In which case, I will be sitting on my rocking chair saying, I knew that kid was bright from the very time I saw them, sleeping in my cultural anthropology class. Well, one final point, and this is not a pleasant one to make, but there are some implications to our hypotheses. As we run out of world resources, as we run out of places to move to, as we run out of abilities to solve our problems without having to impinge upon other people, we are quickly setting ourselves up for a nasty little situation. As the world runs out of resources and as population intensity increases, we are increasingly being forced into a one world government. See that? We are being forced into a one world government as more and more we find ourselves struggling with limited resources and no place to move to, and we start getting envious and upset and determined to help bring other people into alignment with us. This is what started World War II, by the way. Japan wanted the Greater Asian Economic Alliance to be able to build a huge resource-rich area for alliance. Germany wanted to do the same thing for Western Europe. It was all economically driven. They tried to bring on a one world government. It did not work. We are slowly being forced into this again. Seems to me there's something in the Bible about this, isn't there? You are on your way. What does that look like? I can only say that we can, at best, simply forestall the inevitable by being responsible stewards, hopefully for several more generations. Otherwise, we will bring on the inevitable climax of what the scriptures describe for us. Alrighty? Come back Thursday, ready for a test.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.